Setzen Sie sich.
Ich bin nervös. Das wird hart. Ich habe noch nie darüber gesprochen. Mein Ex-Mann hat mir eine SMS geschrieben und gefragt, warum tust du das? Wieso wühlst du in der Vergangenheit? Für mich ist das nicht die Vergangenheit. Es ist die Gegenwart. Mein Leben. Ich versuche damit, so gut ich kann, fertig zu werden, damit es weitergeht. In dem Alter mochte ich ihn nicht. Aber eine Mutter, die ihr eigenes Kind nicht mag? Diese Augen. Ich mochte die Augen nicht. Ich kann es nicht beschreiben. Sie sind einfach böse. Aus dem kleinen Jungen mit dem Teddy wurde ein Mörder. Und das ist noch immer schwer zu begreifen. Ich ging aufs College, um Krankenschwester zu werden. Im ersten Jahr wurde ich mit Derek schwanger. Ich war erst 19 und nicht bereit, Mutter zu werden. Ich hatte Angst. Am 13. November 1991 wurde mein Sohn geboren. Er war so perfekt, mit schwarzem Haar und Pausbäckchen. Ich dachte an all die Dinge, die wir gemeinsam unternehmen würden. Fahrradfahren, Fangen spielen und mit Spielzeugautos spielen. Lauter Jungszeug eben. Als er älter wurde, wurde er aggressiv. Er war zerstörerisch und widerspenstig. Ich weiß noch, wie wir mal beim Einkaufen an Lastern vorbeikamen und Derek einen haben wollte. Stell das zurück, du hast schon genug. Ich sagte nein. Ich habe heute dafür kein Geld. Wir kaufen Lebensmittel. Anstatt ihn zurückzustellen, knallte er ihn so lange auf den Boden, bis er zerbrach. Ich wusste, ich hätte strenger durchgreifen müssen. Aber ich musste immer wieder daran denken, wie krank er mal war. Mit 7 Wochen bekam Derek eine Atemwegs- und Lungenentzündung und musste mit einem Rettungshubschrauber in eine größere Klinik nach Duluth, Minnesota gebracht werden. Damals sagte der Arzt, ich kann Ihnen nicht versprechen, dass er den Flug überlebt. Ich habe sehr gelitten, weil ich ihn fast verloren hätte und wollte das nicht nochmal riskieren. Er sollte ein glückliches Leben haben. Ich ließ ihm alles durchgehen. Er bekam, was er wollte.
Ich will ihn haben.
Derek schrie jähzornig, ich will den Laster. Da habe ich ihn gekauft. Ich wusste, dass es falsch war. Ich konnte nicht Nein sagen. Es gab schon Anzeichen von Zwangsstörungen. Ich hielt das für Marotten. Er rührte sein Essen nicht an. Keine Sandwiches, keine Donuts. Und Kartoffelchips aß er nur mit der Gabel. Derek spielte nie mit seinem Spielzeug. Er hat alles fein säuberlich aufgereiht und nie Häuser oder sowas gebaut. Alles musste ordentlich sein. Er war kontaktarm und blieb lieber für sich. Asoziales Verhalten habe ich bei ihm zum ersten Mal bemerkt, als die Söhne meiner Freundin bei uns waren. Sie rannten in Dereks Zimmer und wollten mit den Lastern spielen. Aber das wollte Derek nicht. Sobald jemand seine Sachen anfasste, verkrampfte sich sein ganzer Körper. Er ballte die Fäuste und fing an zu zittern. Ich weiß noch, dass Derek ihn mit beiden Händen umwarf und auf ihn einprügelte. Ich hatte Derek gerade weggezerrt, als die Mutter des Kleinen reinkam. Ich habe verschwiegen, dass Derek ihn geschubst und geschlagen hatte. Ich habe nur gesagt, er mag es nicht, wenn man sein Spielzeug anfasst. Danach blieb Derek allein in seinem Zimmer und der kleine Junge blieb bei uns im Wohnzimmer. Und Derek hat sein Spielzeug bewacht. Ich traf mich mit Robert. Er wird dich mögen, das spüre ich. Fürs erste Kennenlernen hatte ich Robert zu uns nach Hause eingeladen.
Hey, buddy.
Derek ging auf ihn zu. Und mein Freund streichelte sein Haar und scheitelte es. Ich habe gefragt, was machst du? Er antwortete, ich suche nach einer Teufelszahl. Ich habe es nicht ernst genommen. Trotzdem dachte ich, mein Gott, etwas stimmt nicht mit Derek und alle können es sehen.
Nicht schießen.
Als ich wissen wollte, wieso er das gesagt hat, meinte er, ich habe Spaß gemacht, aber irgendwie auch nicht. Es war der Ausdruck in seinen Augen. Als Baby hatte er große, strahlend blaue Augen.
Bright blue eyes. And then suddenly they just became.
Doch plötzlich veränderten sie sich. Sie waren nicht mehr groß und strahlend, sondern klein und verschlagen. Ohne Emotionen, völlig leer.
I think this
Ein Schnappschuss von dem einzigen Kuss, den ich je von Derek bekommen habe. Mein Lieblingsbild. Ich habe ständig seine Liebe gesucht und alles getan, um ihn glücklich zu machen. Alles für eine Umarmung, einen Kuss oder ein Ich hab dich lieb. Ich hab's versucht, aber nie ein Zeichen der Zuneigung bekommen. Für Derek hatte es bisher keine Regeln gegeben. Es war am Weihnachtsmorgen. Die Geschenke lagen unter dem Baum. Ich hatte für Derek die neueste Spielkonsole ergattert. Ich war total aufgeregt. Dafür hatte ich auf einem Gartenstuhl vor dem Supermarkt kampiert. So sehr wollte ich das Spiel für ihn. Bob war als Erster aufgestanden und hatte ein tolles Frühstück gemacht. Derek kam runter und wollte Geschenke auspacken, aber Bob sagte, zuerst wird gefrühstückt. Derek antwortete, ich habe keinen Hunger. Aber Bob bestand darauf, dass wir zuerst frühstücken.
Die Geschenke können warten. Setz dich.
Zum ersten Mal im Leben bekam Derek klare Anweisungen. Aber Derek wollte nichts essen. Da sagte Bob, du sitzt da, bis du dein Rührei gegessen hast. Derek sagte, gut. Ich stand auf und habe Geschirr gespült. Und Derek saß da. Er blieb einfach sitzen. Derek sat there. So lange, bis es Zeit war, ins Bett zu gehen. Er wollte Bob die Stirn bieten. Als Bob am nächsten Tag zur Arbeit gegangen war, ging ich in Dereks Zimmer und sagte, heute ist ein neuer Tag. Bob ist weg. Lass uns Geschenke auspacken. Aber er war auch noch am nächsten Tag wütend. Statt sich über das Geschenk zu freuen, das er sich gewünscht hatte, hat er die Konsole zertrümmert. Er stand auf und ging in sein Zimmer. Ich habe alles wieder eingepackt und zurück ins Geschäft gebracht. Ich habe gesagt, dass es schon beim Transport kaputt gegangen sein muss und bekam Ersatz. Ich gab sie Derek und er hatte sein Geschenk. Heute schäme ich mich. Aber er sollte glücklich sein und ein Videospiel haben. Er hat eine Zeit lang Hockey gespielt und wollte immer eine Stunde vor Spielbeginn da sein. Eines Tages haben wir es nicht geschafft.
Derek smashed the TV.
Aus Wut darüber hat er den Fernseher zertrümmert. Weil ich nicht wollte, dass Robert das erfährt, habe ich den Fernseher in den Karton gepackt und zurückgebracht. Ich habe behauptet, er wäre kaputt geliefert worden. Und ich bekam einen neuen. Das war das Einfachste. Derek war glücklich, Bob würde es nie erfahren und es kam gar nicht erst zum Krach. Bob hat Derek nie geschlagen, aber Derek hat ihn ständig herausgefordert.
Derek wanted Bob to get physical.
Manchmal saß er in seinem Zimmer mit seinem Videospiel und wir wollten weggehen.
It's time to go, let's go.
Mach Schluss. Wir gehen mit deiner Mutter essen.
He would just
Er blieb sitzen,
sit there
Hey, come on, let's go.
and
spielte weiter und ignorierte uns.
ignore us. And Bob would
Das machte Bob
in
wütend.
his face. Bob would
Er stellte
stand
sich
between
zwischen
Derek
Derek
and
und
the
den
television
Fernseher und sagte,
and say,
steh auf, wir
"Get up, we're
gehen.
going." Derek would stand up.
Derek baute sich vor Bob auf und versuchte ihn zu reizen.
Bob on.
Und was willst du jetzt tun? Willst du mich schlagen? Tu's doch. Er provozierte ihn ständig. Ich glaube, er wollte, dass Bob ihn schlägt, damit er ihn verklagen und ins Gefängnis bringen konnte. Er hätte sich nicht gewehrt. Jedes Mal, wenn sie sich gestritten haben, gab ich Bob die Schuld, obwohl ich wusste, dass Derek im Unrecht war. Aber Derek war mir wichtiger als Bob. Ich fühlte mich hilflos. Ich dachte, er würde sich nie ändern. Es gab nichts, was ihn glücklich machen konnte. Ich wollte nicht, dass er immer voller Zorn war. Ich brachte ihn zu einer Anti-Aggressionstherapie, um ihn von seiner ständigen Wut zu befreien. Dort wurde er als depressiv diagnostiziert. Er bekam Medikamente, aber die halfen nicht. Er wurde nur apathisch. Wenn ich ihm sagte, dass ich ihn liebe, meinte er nur, okay. Macy war groß, schlank und hübsch. Sie hatte langes, tiefschwarzes Haar, große braune Augen und sie war sehr lustig. Sie sprühte vor Lebenslust. Als Derek sie kennenlernte, veränderte er sich total. Ich habe ihn nie so glücklich gesehen. Er lachte und war zärtlich.
He was smiling. He was affectionate. And it made me happy.
Ich war glücklich, als ich sah, dass er zu Gefühlen fähig war.
That Derek was capable
Das
of
hatte ich bisher
I
bezweifelt.
wasn't sure. By this time,
Meine Ehe mit Bob
and
war
his marriage
gescheitert.
was over. When Derek
Dann erzählte Derek mir, dass Macy schwanger ist. Ich bot beiden an, bei mir zu leben, vorausgesetzt, sie gingen weiter zur Schule und halfen mir im Haushalt.
That they helped me around the house, that things would be good.
Das erste Weihnachten mit dem kleinen Gabe. Es war ein schönes Fest. Auf dem Bild strahlt Derek übers ganze Gesicht. Er war ein toller Vater und ganz vernarrt in Gabe. Derek hatte damals schon seinen Abschluss, aber Macy ging noch zur Highschool. Also hat er sich den ganzen Tag um seinen Sohn gekümmert. Er hat ihn gefüttert und gewickelt. Ich war so stolz. Wir waren alle sehr glücklich, aber es währte nicht lange. Alles musste so sein, wie er es wollte. Die Vorhänge im Haus mussten zugezogen bleiben. Wenn ich sie morgens geöffnet hatte, kam er und zog sie wieder zu. Macy durfte nur zur Arbeit gehen und musste dann sofort nach Hause kommen.
Wo warst du?
Mit Freunden aus.
Ich will, dass du nach der Arbeit sofort nach Hause kommst. Du gehörst hierher.
Ich hatte den Eindruck, das war keine Liebe mehr. Das war Kontrolle.
Listen to me.
Sie stritten oft.
You come home right after work, okay?
Derek.
Zuerst zankten sich die beiden, dann griff er mich an.
You're a pathetic loser.
Er beschimpfte mich, nannte mich dämlich und erbärmlich. Er hat mich verachtet und ausgelacht.
Sieh dich an, du bist betrunken.
Er schrie mich wütend an. Du bist eine Niete. Alles, was du kannst, ist trinken. Das ist deine Art, mit der Welt fertig zu werden. Er fand mich jämmerlich. So fühlte ich mich auch. Ich fand, er hatte recht. Ich war ihm nicht gewachsen. Mit 19 fing er an, mir zu drohen.
Derek bought an AK-47.
Er kaufte ohne mein Wissen eine Kalaschnikow. Ich sah sie zum ersten Mal, als er sie auf dem Küchentisch gereinigt hat.
He was cleaning it. And I walked
Er drehte sich um und richtete die Waffe auf mich.
And he said,
Er fragte, mach ich dir Angst, Mutter?
And I thought,
Ich war wie erstarrt.
oh my God. And that's when he
Dann
told
sagte
me,
er,
"You better
bleib
sleep
wachsam,
well,
weil ich dir im Schlaf die Kehle durchschneide.
in your sleep."
Ich sah seinen Gesichtsausdruck und wusste, er meint es ernst.
He just might do this.
Ich blieb den ganzen Tag in meinem Schlafzimmer. Obwohl es mein Haus war, wollte ich ihm nicht über den Weg laufen. Ein Freund hatte einen Türriegel angebracht.
Hey, trinkst du schon wieder?
Durch die geschlossene Tür fragte er mich, ob ich eine Lebensversicherung habe. Er wollte wissen, bei welcher Gesellschaft und wo die Police ist. Und ich saß in meinem Zimmer und trank. Mein Schlafzimmer war meine physische Zuflucht und der Alkohol meine seelische. Ich wollte mich betäuben. Doch ich fühlte mich schuldig. Ich fragte mich, was bin ich für eine Mutter, die ihr eigenes Kind nicht liebt? Das ist doch nicht normal. Dann wieder sagte ich mir, er ist auch nicht normal. Ich hatte Angst vor seinem Charakter, vor seinen Wutausbrüchen. Er war eine tickende Zeitbombe. Ich fürchtete, dass er das Haus nie verlassen würde und sah uns mit 80 Jahren immer noch zusammen unter einem Dach leben. Es gab kein Entrinnen.
Ich kann nicht mehr.
Macy und ich haben vergeblich überlegt, wie wir ihn dazu bringen konnten, auszuziehen.
Er ist eine Bedrohung für uns beide und das Kind.
Aber wenn wir ihn rauswarfen, wo sollte er hin? Obwohl er gemeingefährlich war, konnte ich ihn nicht vor die Tür setzen, ohne ein Dach über dem Kopf. Ich habe jeden Tag gehasst und mich nach dem Aufwachen gefragt, was passiert heute? Wir hatten eine Labrador-Hündin mit dem Namen Lucy. Derek mochte sie nicht. Er hasste die Hundehaare und die Unordnung. Dann wurde bei mir die Gallenblase entfernt. Als ich aus dem Krankenhaus kam, war Lucy nicht da. Als ich gefragt habe, wo sie ist, sagte Derek, sie ist auf die Straße gelaufen und überfahren worden. Er sagte, er hat die Polizei gerufen. Die hat Lucy zum Tierarzt gebracht und sie wurde eingeäschert. Ich wollte die Urne sehen. Er antwortete, das hätte nur extra Geld gekostet. Er hätte die Asche dagelassen. Ich weiß, er hat sie getötet. In den 2 Jahren, in denen wir da wohnten, ist sie nie auf die Straße gelaufen. Aber ich wollte seine Geschichte vermutlich glauben. Ich wollte nicht wahrhaben, dass er sie getötet hatte. Und ich habe es akzeptiert. Ich hatte Angst, um Hilfe zu bitten. Ich fürchtete mich vor Dereks Rache, wenn er herausfindet, dass ich mit anderen über ihn gesprochen habe. Mein Hund war tot. Ich wusste nicht, was als nächstes passieren würde. An ihrem 18. Geburtstag kam Macy zu mir und sagte, sie zieht aus. Sie ertrug Dereks Kontrollwahn und die Streitereien nicht länger. Sie wollte ihr eigenes Leben führen, ohne Derek, der ihr ständig sagte, was sie zu tun hatte. Sie ging ohne ihr Kind. Sie wusste, er würde ihr Gabe niemals überlassen. Ich beneidete sie. Sie konnte weg. Sie tat das, wozu mir immer der Mut gefehlt hatte. Sie ging. Ich habe geweint und wir haben uns umarmt. Ich habe ihr gesagt, wie stolz ich auf sie bin und mich freue, wenn sie endlich frei ist von Derek. Sie ist weg. Ich sagte, sie kommt nicht mehr zurück. Derek wurde nicht wütend. Er bekam keinen der üblichen Anfälle, bei denen er alles zertrümmerte. Hast du mich verstanden? Er machte völlig zu. Das war fast noch schlimmer. Es machte mir Angst, dass er so ruhig blieb. Und ich wartete darauf, dass die Bombe hochging. Derek benahm sich seltsam. So hatte ich ihn noch nie erlebt. Die Wohnzimmervorhänge waren offen. Er lief händeringend vor dem Fenster auf und ab. Er wiederholte immer, Gabe wird nie zu einem anderen Mann Dad sagen. Ich fragte ihn, was redest du da? Was ist los mit dir? Er sagte immer nur, Gabe wird nie zu einem anderen Mann Dad sagen. Ich bekam eine Heidenangst. Ich wusste nicht, was ich tun sollte und rief Robert, meinen Ex, an und fragte ihn, kannst du mit Derek reden? Irgendwas stimmt nicht mit ihm. Und Bob wollte ihn nach Feierabend anrufen. Später bekam ich eine E-Mail von Robert. Derek sei deprimiert und entmutigt, wäre aber okay. Als ich nach Hause kam, stand Macys Wagen in der Einfahrt. Und der Wagen von Derek war weg. Ich sah zum Haus. Die Haustür stand offen und ich wusste sofort, irgendwas stimmt nicht.
Okay, something's not right.
Als ich nachsehen wollte, wieso sie offen stand, bemerkte ich blutige Spuren.
A trail of bloody footprints.
Mein erster Gedanke war, Derek hatte in seiner Wut einen Spiegel zertrümmert und sich geschnitten. Ich bin den Spuren gefolgt, durch den Flur, bis zu meinem Badezimmer. Die Tür war zu. Und unter der Tür war eine große Blutlache. Ich öffnete die Tür. Macy lag mit durchgeschnittener Kehle in der Wanne. Es war, als würde vor meinem Auge ein Film ablaufen. Es war so irreal.
This can't be real. This can't be happening.
Ich habe die Notrufnummer gewählt. Dann kam die Polizei. Und erst da dachte ich an das Kind.
Oh my God, where's the baby?
Ich sagte den Beamten, dass ich Gabe vermisse. Sie sollten ihn suchen. Sie gingen ins Haus und sahen nach. Er war nicht da. Ich dachte, er tut Gabe etwas an und bringt sich dann selbst um. Sie brachten mich zur Wache. Ich war blutverschmiert und sie behielten mich da. Das bin ich auf der Polizeiwache, nachdem ich Macy gefunden hatte. Ich habe sie angefleht, mir zu helfen, Gabe zu finden. Ich habe die Beamten angeschrien. Sie sollen aufhören, mich zu verhören und lieber nach dem Kind suchen. Ich war in Panik. Die Polizei fragte mich, wo ist er ihrer Meinung nach hingegangen? Aber ich hatte keine Ahnung. Gegen 5 Uhr früh erkannte der Portier eines Motels in Wisconsin Rapids Derek und Gabe aufgrund der Suchmeldung im Fernsehen. Daraufhin rief er die Polizei. Ich geriet in Panik. Ich musste damit rechnen, dass er beim Anblick der Polizei schießen würde. Ich hatte Angst, er würde sich und das Kind umbringen. Als die Polizei eintraf, war er in seinem Zimmer. Mein Sohn wurde ohne Widerstand verhaftet. Dem Baby ging es gut. Dereks Schuhe waren voller Blut. Sie passten zu den Abdrücken im Haus.
Were from Derek's shoes. They found the knife.
Das Messer lag in seinem Wagen. Mein Sohn ist ein Mörder.
Hey, Mother, it's me. I'm sorry about this whole thing. I didn't mean for anything to happen like this. I'm really sorry.
Der Anruf hat mich überrascht. Ich wollte glauben, dass es ihm leid tat, dass er das alles nicht gewollt hatte, dass nur ihre Streitereien schuld waren.
All I can say is I'm still just really sorry about the whole situation. There's nothing I can do about it now. I'd do anything to go back in time, but it's not how life works.
Er sagte zwar, es tut mir leid, aber es klang nicht so.
I love you too. Please take good care of my baby.
Zum ersten Mal sagte er, ich liebe dich, weil er in der Klemme saß und Hilfe brauchte. Ich traf mich mehrere Male mit seiner Pflichtverteidigerin. Obwohl ich ihn nicht mochte, wollte ich nicht, dass er ins Gefängnis kommt. Ich habe immer Dereks Fehler ausgebügelt, sein ganzes Leben lang. Das war nun mal so. Derek baut Mist, ich biege es gerade. Derek macht was kaputt, ich ersetze den Schaden. Nun war er in Schwierigkeiten und ich muss ihm helfen. Ich sprach mit dem Staatsanwalt, mit den Rechtsanwälten und fragte mich, was mache ich? Wieso versuche ich ihm zu helfen, wenn wer weiß, was passieren kann, sobald er draußen ist? Wird das Leben wieder so wie früher oder noch schlimmer? Findet er ein neues Opfer? Wann endet das? Ein Freund schickte mir eine SMS. Oh mein Gott. Und 2 Ausrufezeichen. Derek hatte sich schuldig bekannt, Macy ermordet zu haben.
To Macy's murder.
Irgendwie war ich froh. Ich dachte nur, in 40 Jahren bin ich tot. Er wird nie mehr in meine Nähe kommen. Ich habe Gabe adoptiert. Er ist mein kleiner Junge. Ich kümmere mich um ihn, seit er 2 Jahre alt ist. Und versuche, ihn so gesund und normal wie möglich großzuziehen. Aber jedes Mal, wenn Gabe etwas tut, was mich an Derek erinnert, flippe ich aus. Er soll nicht so werden wie sein Vater. Da reicht eine Kleinigkeit. Ich backe eine Pizza und Derek will sie nicht essen. Oh Gott, ich habe Derek gesagt.
Gabe.
Hört das je auf?
Sicher.
Als ich an dem Abend Macy entdeckt hatte, habe ich mein Haus für immer verlassen.
Nach
dem, was ich gesehen hatte, konnte ich nicht mehr zurück. Ich blieb auf der Farm von Freunden. Ich stand unter Schock und hatte Angst. Gabe und ich haben uns ferngehalten von Fernsehen, Zeitungen und Internet. Das ist ein Foto von Macys Grab. Ich hatte Angst, zur Beerdigung zu gehen. Ich hatte Angst, die Leute wären wütend auf mich. Ich hatte Angst vor Macys Familie und dachte, sie würde mir die Schuld an allem geben, weil ich zu schwach gewesen war. Zu schwach zu gehen. Ich war nie an Macys Grab und hoffe, dass ich es Gabe eines Tages zeigen kann. Macy starb im September und ich blieb bis Oktober auf der Farm. Dann habe ich die Stadt verlassen und bin nie zurückgekehrt. Seit dem Mord sind fast 5 Jahre vergangen und ich versuche es zu verarbeiten. Ich versuche den Leuten zu erklären, was Macy, ich und der kleine Gabe durchgemacht haben. Die Menschen werden über mich richten und ich trage eine große Schuld.
I carry so much guilt. I have so much guilt.
Ich habe Macy sehr geliebt und wünschte, ich hätte sie retten können. Sie war ein kluges, hübsches Mädchen und ich schäme mich sehr. Jeden Tag denke ich, was hätte ich tun können, wenn man mich fragt, wieso hast du...
The static on a 30-year-old VHS tape doesn't justice. It screams with the muffled agony of a reality that this city spent 3 decades trying to paint over with suburban lawns and strip mall compliance. It was August 22nd, 1996, a Thursday night thick with the heavy, unmoving heat of a late Midwestern summer, a night when 22-year-old kindergarten teacher Maya Lynn stepped out onto her second-floor apartment balcony to water a dying fern and vanished directly into the humid dark. No scream disturbed the neighborhood cricket hum. No signs of a struggle fractured the sterile order of her living room. The front door remained locked from the inside. Her car keys rested on the kitchen counter next to an unfinished glass of sweet tea, and her purse sat untouched on the entryway table containing $84 in cash and a plane ticket to her sister's wedding in Denver. She didn't run. She didn't slip away to start a new life under an assumed name. She was simply erased from the coordinates of the living in the span of a 3-minute blind spot, leaving behind a cold case that would turn into a multi-generational infection within the county sheriff's department. The original investigators found nothing but a single, strange clue that defied forensic classification at the time: a tiny, gold-plated sewing thimble placed precisely in the center of her unmade bed, its hollow interior coated with a microscopic trace of industrial baseline grease that the primitive state labs of the 90s couldn't trace to any specific machine or refinery. That single, bizarre calling card didn't just stall the inquiry. It initiated a 30-year psychological siege within the community of Ridgecrest, an unresolved nightmare that transformed every backyard barbecue into a theater of suspicion and every unlit basement window into a glaring eye of hidden malice. For 3 decades, the white cardboard archive box containing Maya's lesson plans, her childhood photographs, and the grease-stained thimble sat on the bottom shelf of the precinct vault, gathering the gray dust of institutional failure while successive administrations tried to convince the public that the girl had simply walked into the river out of youthful despair. But justice is an impatient predator, and on this morning, the decades of synthetic peace have been violently shattered by a forensic breakthrough that rips the floorboards out from under the city's oldest neighborhood, turning a respectable front porch into the epicenter of a capital murder dragnet. The digital processing bays at the state's newly retrofitted high-density genetic tracking center do not flinch, sleep, or succumb to the selective amnesia that small towns use to survive their own rot. It was exactly 4:12 a.m. on June 17, 2026, when an automated sequence analysis terminal in the Capitol began to chatter, its display screens rendering a 100% familial DNA match between a degraded epithelial cell recovered from the interior ridge of that 1996 gold thimble and a routine cheek swab submitted to a national registry by a 31-year-old civil engineer applying for a state transit passport. The match didn't point to a nomadic drifter or a dead convict whose record had already been closed. It pinned a direct lineage to a living, breathing fixture of the Ridgecrest community, a 73-year-old retired high school biology teacher who lived in the green-shingled house directly adjacent to Maya Lin's old apartment complex. The realization hit the current task force with the concussive force of a physical blow. The monster they had been hunting across 3 time zones and 30 years hadn't fled the state or assumed a ghost identity in the margins of the West Coast. He had stayed right there. He had mowed his lawn every single Saturday morning since the summer of 1996, watched the search parties from his kitchen window, and offered plates of homemade cookies to the very detectives who were sweating through their shirts trying to find the man who tore his young neighbor out of her life. The operational transition from an archival cross-check into an active, lethal tier arrest deployment took less than 40 minutes, the tactical frequencies of the state police completely locking down into encrypted channels as 4 unmarked black armored transport units slid out of the precinct garage into the gray dawn drizzle. They were chasing a predator who had used the absolute predictability of a mundane, respectable life as his radar shield, an individual who understood that the best place to hide a drop of blood is inside a jar of red paint, and the best place to hide a capital crime is behind a friendly nod over a white picket fence. The air over the Ridgecrest Historic District this morning carries the metallic, sharp scent of ozone and wet cedar, a pressurized quiet that always precedes a lightning strike or a total institutional collapse. The tactical convoy did not use sirens or emergency strobes as it turned onto Elm Street. The vehicles moved with the silent, heavy momentum of a harvesting machine, their tires whistling against the wet brick gutters where Maya Lin used to walk her dog. The primary target of the federal warrants was Arthur Pendleton, the man who had taught 3 generations of local children the mechanics of cellular division, the man who had served as the treasurer for the Neighborhood Preservation Society, and the face that everyone in the city associated with quiet, academic retirement. For 30 years, he had built a fortress out of his own harmlessness, utilizing his silver hair, his collection of antique clocks, and his immaculate garden to create a psychological barrier that no local investigator had dared to breach without an ironclad order from a circuit judge. But the machine of 2026 doesn't care about a suspect's social standing, his history of civic donations, or the fact that he currently suffers from a mild heart murmur. The entry teams cleared his wrought iron garden gates in less than 3 seconds, their heavy body armor whispering against the wet hydrangeas as they deployed around the perimeter of the green-shingled house with the synchronized fluidity of a high-tech extraction unit. There was no bullhorn announcement, no polite request for a voluntary surrender that would give the old man time to flush his hard drives or reach for the old target pistol he kept beneath his mattress. The concussive entry team breached the kitchen door with a single, synchronized hydraulic strike, the white plaster debris from the frame blowing across the clean linoleum floor and settling like a localized winter storm over the half-finished crossword puzzle and the warm coffee mug sitting on the counter. When the smoke cleared, the city's most respected former educator was on his stomach in his flannel slippers, his thin wrists secured by heavy black zip ties that bit deep into his liver-spotted skin, his mouth making a low, whistling sound of total compliance, as if he had been rehearsing this exact moment of capture every night for 30 years. The interrogation cell in the basement of the Capitol Judicial Complex is a clean, featureless concrete cube where the air feels scrubbed of all human history, recycled through heavy iron vents that hum with the high-voltage frequency of the digital monitoring arrays. Arthur Pendleton sat motionless at the steel table, his shoulders hunched beneath his beige cardigan, his spectacles sitting slightly askew on the bridge of his nose as he stared down at his own reflection in the polished metal surface. He didn't look at the document screens that were displaying high-definition digital scans of his 1996 utility bills and personal journals onto the wall across from his chair. His focus was entirely locked onto Detective Sarah Vance, the woman who had spent the last 7 years of her life tracking the ghost of Maya Lin through the bureaucratic blind spots of the county record books. She didn't begin the session with an explosion of accusatory anger or a display of graphic crime scene photos. She simply placed the original gold sewing thimble in the center of the table between them, its gold plating reflecting the harsh, unyielding glare of the recessed halogen lights above like a tiny, solid eye of pure accusation. The suspect's fingers twitched slightly against his knees, a micro-expression of absolute recognition that was captured in high definition by the biometric cameras mounted behind the two-way glass. "You taught her how to mount the biological specimens on glass slides, didn't you, Arthur?" Sarah said, her voice dropping into a level, rhythmic register that cut through the silence of the room like a diamond blade through dry bone. "She thought you were just a lonely old man who wanted to help her with her classroom science projects. She didn't know that you had been logging her split times, tracking the exact minute she turned off her bedroom television, and mapping the structural access lines of the crawl space beneath her floorboards for 6 months before the night the lights went out on Elm Street." The suspect's mouth twitched, a tiny, vertical fracture appearing in the mask of grandfatherly confusion he had maintained since the flashbangs went off in his kitchen. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't challenge the validity of the genetic genealogy match. He simply reached out a trembling, age-spotted hand and touched the rim of the gold thimble with the tip of his fingernail, a gesture of absolute intimacy that made the skin of the observing technicians crawl behind the glass. She had a very specific way of holding the needle when she was repairing the classroom cushions, Pendleton whispered, his voice a dry, rattling hiss that sounded like dead leaves being dragged across a concrete driveway by a winter wind. She never used the standard aluminum thimbles. She said they felt cheap, like industrial waste. "I bought her that gold-plated one at the antique fair near the state line in the spring of 1996. It was a gift of appreciation for her neighborliness, a token to show her that someone was paying attention to the details of her life. But she didn't appreciate the details, Detective. She started locking her balcony door after the night I brought her the fresh soil for her ferns. She started looking at me through the curtains with that look of suspicion that turns a neighborhood into a prison." The confession didn't drop as a dramatic, loud outburst. It unfolded with the mechanical, cold precision of a blueprint being unrolled across a desk, a detailed narrative of a 30-year-old obsession that had turned the interior walls of a quiet suburban house into a multi-layered matrix of observation and control. He began to describe the geography of 1996 not as a memory of a lost summer, but as a system of voids and conduits, mapping the exact structural lines of the apartment complex that allowed him to move through the shared maintenance shafts without ever stepping into the street lamps or crossing the path of a civilian witness. The pneumatic concrete saws did not wait for the afternoon sun to break through the gray cloud cover before they began their work in the narrow courtyard between Pendleton's brownstone and Maya's old apartment building. The entire block of Elm Street had been closed under the guise of an emergency natural gas line mitigation order, a strategic deception executed by the Federal Marshal Service to keep the regional news drones from realizing that 40 state police recruits were currently excavating a private rose garden to find the remains of a girl who vanished before the invention of the smartphone. The air over the residential alley was a thick, choking fog of pulverized limestone, stone dust, and the chemical scent of ancient, decaying topsoil that turned the black tactical uniforms of the perimeter guard line into a pale, ghostly gray. The lead forensic anthropologist stood at the edge of the newly opened trench with her hands braced on her hips, her eyes tracking the movement of the mini excavator as its steel bucket peeled away the layers of brick paving stones that Arthur Pendleton had personally laid down in the autumn of 1996. Each layer of earth removed was a decade of historical deception stripped away, the modern landscaping aggregate of the 2010s, the coarse gravel matrix of the early 2000s, and finally, a thick, dark subbase of high-density industrial concrete that had been mixed with coal slag to form an absolute, permanent seal over the old root cellar entrance behind his carriage house. The clock on the dashboard of the mobile command unit read exactly 2:14 p.m. when the diamond-tipped blade of the main concrete saw hit a void, a sudden vertical drop in mechanical resistance that caused the operator to kill his engine instantly, leaving nothing but the sound of the gray rain hitting the plastic tarps and the heavy, ragged breathing of the excavation team. The anthropologist dropped into the pit on her hands and knees, her high-powered headlamp cutting through the damp steam rising from the wet concrete as she used a horsehair brush to clear away the white slurry from a long, narrow wooden panel that had been wrapped in multiple layers of heavy, grease-coated industrial plastic. It wasn't building material, it was a vintage 1950s cedar hope chest, its brass latches sealed shut with lead solder that had been applied with a soldering iron from Pendleton's own basement workshop. The Chandong Kin Hong went through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered behind the distant security cordons like a physical current, a collective gasp that seemed to drop the temperature of Elm Street by 10 degrees in a single second as the realization took hold that the ghost story was real. They had spent 30 years watching Arthur Pendleton water his prize-winning roses on this exact spot, had seen him host neighborhood association tea parties less than 5 feet from the concrete slab, never realizing that the pavement beneath their lawn chairs was the ceiling of a tomb, a deliberate, calculated sarcophagus engineered by their favorite neighbor to hold the physical record of his crime forever within his reach. The arrest of Arthur Pendleton and the opening of the cedar chest didn't just smash the 30-year-old cold case, it initiated a complete moral and structural collapse within the civic institutions of Ridgecrest. By 5 o'clock that evening, federal marshals had executed secondary search warrants at the municipal archives and the offices of the former county coroner, seizing 3 decades of internal medical logs, death certificates, and unaudited burial registries that had been managed by Pendleton's late brother in the late 90s. What they were uncovering wasn't a solitary act of sudden predatory passion, but a systematic network of institutional protection, a small-town cartel of mutual silence that had used Pendleton's academic respectability and his family's connections to bury dozens of administrative anomalies, illegal land deals, and sudden deaths that had funded the political landscape of the valley since the end of the industrial boom. The Matt Tichbian of Maya Lin wasn't a casual encounter with a monster in the dark. It was an enforcement action, an administrative execution carried out because her work with the local clinic's neighborhood immunization records had begun to uncover a statistical cluster of heavy metal poisoning among the children living near the old chemical refinery, a property that Pendleton's Preservation Society had secretly sold to a regional development corporation 48 hours before her disappearance. The old teacher in his cell hadn't just been running from a murder charge. He had been the structural keystone of an entire regional empire of corruption, and now that his DNA had been verified by the database, the entire arch was coming down around the heads of the people who thought their lineage made them immortal. The scene outside the county courthouse at dawn looked like a high-definition simulation of a political coup, the double lines of state tactical units pinning back thousands of local residents who had stayed through the freezing rain to witness the formal arraignment of the city's master biology teacher. There were no cameras flashing when the transport van backed down the concrete ramp. The federal marshals had established a wall of high-intensity strobe panels that blinded anyone attempting to get a clean digital image of the suspect's face as he was led up the stone steps in transit chains, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely from his narrow, age-shrunken shoulders. The city was no longer a coherent community. It had split down its seams into those who remembered Maya Lin's brief life and those who had built their suburban wealth on the profits of her erasure, a sociological fracture that was turning every neighborhood council and every business board into a battleground of recrimination and blame. The digital news tickers were completely jammed with the names of prominent figures who were resigning their positions or leaving the state before the federal grand jury could unseal the next round of true bills, former police captains who had signed off on the runaway logs, circuit court judges who had approved Pendleton's land variances without an audit, and contractors who had purchased the surrounding parcels 48 hours after the concrete was poured over the rose garden. The true scale of the Chandong Xe Hoi was impossible to calculate. It was an emotional and moral bankruptcy that changed the way the residents looked at their own streets, their own history, and their own leaders, exposing their celebrated era of peaceful progress as nothing more than a performance staged by a syndicate of white-collar executioners. Inside the forensic laboratory at the Capitol complex, the air was perfectly static, the only sound being the continuous, low-frequency hum of the exhaust hoods as Dr. Kincaid laid the recovered skeletal matrix onto a series of stainless steel examination trays in perfect anatomical position. The bones were complete, preserved by the unique, dry anaerobic environment of the sealed cedar chest, their surfaces stained a dark, antique mahogany by the natural oils of the wood and the chemical runoff from the industrial plastic wrapping. She used a digital magnifying endoscope to examine the posterior aspect of the left parietal bone, where a single, clean fracture line extended outward in a sharp starburst pattern, indicating a high-velocity blow delivered with a heavy, flat-faced iron tool, while the target was facing away from her attacker. There are no defensive wounds on the ulnar shafts or the metacarpal elements, she stated into the recording array, her voice flat, clinical, and completely devoid of emotional weight. The impact site perfectly matches the dimensions of a heavy iron lab weight, the kind used to calibrate the old mechanical balances in the high school biology department during the mid-90s. The force of the blow would have caused immediate, absolute cessation of all motor function before she ever touched the floor of the balcony. She was gone before she knew the dark had moved in on her, Sarah. The monster didn't give her time to scream. The case against Arthur Pendleton and his surviving co-conspirators was now an absolute mathematical certainty, a bulletproof wall of physical, digital, and forensic facts that left no room for legal strategy or political influence to intervene. The federal prosecutor's office had already drafted a comprehensive racketeering and capital murder indictment that treated the entire Neighborhood Preservation Society of 1996 as a continuous criminal enterprise, a legal maneuver that allowed the state to freeze every asset, every bank account, and every corporate holding linked to Pendleton's development projects since the day Maya disappeared. The old man in his cell remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the steel door line with a cold, triumphant malice that showed he still didn't care about the prison sentence. He had outsmarted the detectives for 30 years, outlived the witnesses, and forced the town that worshipped his family to tear itself apart to get him back. A final, grim achievement that he wore like a medal as the guards prepared to move him to the maximum security wing. The final report on the Elm Street excavation was entered into the Federal Justice Registry at exactly 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, an unremarked bureaucratic event that brought a formal end to the largest, most disruptive cold case investigation in the state's modern history. The document was 900 pages of structural charts, DNA sequence graphs, and soil analysis tables, a clinical epitaph that didn't include the words closure or peace anywhere in its text, because those aren't things that can be verified by an algorithm or filed away in a steel cabinet. The highway department had already laid a new layer of black asphalt over the crater near the old courtyard, a dark, steaming rectangle that looked like a fresh scar on the gray skin of the valley road. But the drivers didn't speed when they cleared the overpass. They slowed down, their eyes drifting toward the shoulder where a small, wooden cross had been hammered into the gravel by Maya Lynn's remaining relatives. The manhunt was over, the suspect was contained, and the secret grave had been emptied. But the silence that settled over Ridgecrest wasn't the calm of justice served. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a house that has been cleared of its contents after a fire, leaving nothing but the smell of soot and the cold, unalterable certainty that the ground beneath your feet is never as solid as it looks when the sun is shining. The forensic processing bay at the state capitol did not turn off its high-intensity LED systems on the night of June 17, 2026. The atmosphere inside the sterile, negative-pressure vault was thick with the clinical odor of aerosolized disinfectants, chemical reagents, and the specific, metallic tang of unsealed evidence bags that had sat in the dark since the second Clinton administration. On the central examination table, the data loops from the automated genetic sequencing array were still pulsing, a steady, mechanical red heartbeat that signaled the completion of a 3 billion-point comparative analysis. The epithelial cells recovered from the inner ridge of that 1996 gold-plated sewing thimble had been matched against the state transit database with a mathematical certainty that obliterated any remaining legal avenues for the defense. Detective Sarah Vance did not leave her position at the technical terminal. Her eyes were bloodshot, tracking the lines of ancestral and forensic metadata that were being rendered onto her screen in real time, converting a 30-year-old cold case file into an active, high-priority capital murder prosecution. The missing person label was officially dead. It had been replaced by a live, predatory timeline that was widening to include every major land transfer, civic preservation grant, and municipal zoning ordinance that Arthur Pendleton had overseen during his tenure as the neighborhood society treasurer. The realization settling into the task force room was not one of simple professional satisfaction, but of a deep, systemic horror. They weren't just dealing with an isolated predator who had committed a random act of violence in the humid dark of 1996. They were looking at a man who had used the absolute respectability of his academic and civic standing to turn the physical blueprint of Ridgecrest into a mechanism for concealment and long-term asset fraud. Look closely at the corporate tax registers from the autumn of 1996. The digital reproductions are razor-sharp, each historical entry verified by the forensic auditing software and flagged with orange high-priority vectors. Within 72 hours of Maya Lin's disappearance, while volunteer search parties were still wading through the river basin with flashlights, Arthur Pendleton had executed an emergency, unaudited land transfer option on behalf of the Ridgecrest Historic Preservation Society. He had signed the documents that cleared the legal titles to the industrial bottomland along the Western Rail Spur, transferring the parcels to a regional development consortium for pennies on the dollar before the State Environmental Protection Commission could deploy its monitoring teams to inspect the municipal well logs. The calculation was flawless in its administrative simplicity. Pendleton understood that a community in the midst of an economic revitalization will always prioritize the promise of incoming commercial capital over the unresolved disappearance of a young schoolteacher. By using his position as society treasurer to fast-track the land clearance before an official homicide investigation could even be authorized by the county sheriff, he had effectively turned the modernization of the historic district into an unconscious security guard for his secret. Every brick paving stone laid down in the courtyard, every municipal preservation grant approved, and every commercial storefront built along Elm Street was mathematically calibrated to reinforce the seal over the old carriage house root cellar, transforming the daily commerce of the neighborhood into a permanent shield for his crime. As the interrogation in the sub-basement of the Central Precinct entered its 12th consecutive hour, the psychological dynamic between Sarah and the master biology teacher had devolved into a deadweight lock. Arthur Pendleton sat with his spine perfectly straight, his hands folded neatly over his knee in a gesture of calm, authoritative patience that felt like an active insult to the memory of the woman he had destroyed. He had replaced his flannel slippers with standard-issue orange detention slip-ons, but he wore his jumpsuit as if it were a tailored academic robe, his eyes reflecting the harsh white glare of the halogen panels with a cold, glassy detachment that showed no indication of cognitive fatigue. "You are reading a modern moral narrative into an outdated engineering ledger, Sarah," Pendleton said, his voice dropping into that smooth, grandfatherly register that had lulled 3 generations of school board directors into absolute compliance. "You think of Ridgecrest as an arrangement of personal memories and emotional attachments, but to an administrator, a city is nothing more than a vertical stack of structural pressures, land values, and utility conduits." In 1996, the historical district was on the verge of total economic collapse. The old manufacturing plants were dark, the banks were freezing local commercial credit lines, and the city council was preparing to write off Elm Street as a high-density liability zone. That preservation grant didn't just rebuild the facades. It brought $70 million of liquidity into a community that couldn't pay its public transit workers. Maya Lin wasn't an enemy of this town. She was an obstruction to a development package that secured the property values of 10,000 families. You sit there with your warrants and your data screens, but your education, your career, and the very building you are sitting in today were funded by the concrete we poured behind that carriage house. The admission dropped into the digital audio recorder with the heavy, unwashable weight of an executive order. The investigator did not look away from his face. She knew that the recording devices were capturing a confession that went far beyond the legal boundaries of a simple homicide prosecution. This was a structural conspiracy, an explicit acknowledgement that the Matt Tichbian of Maya Lin had been treated by the regional elite as nothing more than an unlisted administrative cost of doing business. Pendleton wasn't just a clinical sociopath who collected personal trophies from his victims. He had functioned as the technical director for a corporate syndicate that had used capital violence to protect an illegal toxic dumping operation from public exposure. The detail the unexpected witness had provided about the night of August 22, 1996, was now being verified by the forensic technicians inside the Capitol Maintenance Depot, where Pendleton's vintage 1988 Ford panel van was being disassembled bolt by bolt. Using high-resolution infrared multispectral cameras, the criminalists had discovered a series of microscopic, iron-heavy chemical signatures embedded deep within the unsealed wood grain of the rear cargo floorboards, a biological spatter pattern that 30 years of commercial cleaners, fuel spills, and mechanical use had failed to strip from the cellular structure of the timber. The metrics of the spatter, the velocity vectors, the distribution radius, and the perfect 3-centimeter impact arc perfectly matched the cranial fracturing patterns identified by the medical examiner on the stainless steel examination trays 3 floors below. The sheer, industrial indifference of the crime was what sustained the SOC Tsongdong, as the transcripts began to flash across the state's digital news loops at noon. The residents of Ridgecrest were no longer simply processing the resolution of an old cold case. They were witnessing the absolute demolition of their local history, forcing themselves to realize that the civic institutions they had trusted, the preservation awards they had celebrated, and the very streets where they walked their children were the products of a lethal network that had functioned with total institutional immunity for 3 decades. The paranoia was becoming an active, destabilizing current inside the neighborhood, turning every old property transaction, every closed-door council vote, and every public appointment since the mid-90s into a suspected act of concealment. The legal teams representing the state's largest real estate investment firms were already scrambling to contain the systemic fallout from the grand jury's initial true bills. At 2:15 p.m., 3 major international banking groups that had underwritten the commercial redevelopments along Elm Street filed a joint emergency motion before the state Supreme Court, seeking an immediate, unconditional freeze on all public titles within the historic district. Their internal compliance officers had realized that if the original land transfers of 1996 were legally classified as the direct products of a capital conspiracy, the deeds to 30 separate commercial properties, including the regional financial offices and the high-density shopping plazas, were legally contaminated, triggering a systemic credit default that could bankrupt the regional bond market before the end of the fiscal quarter. At the Courtyard excavation site, the industrial salvage operation had entered a phase of extreme technical tension. The trench between Pendleton's brownstone and Maya's old apartment building had been deepened to 80 feet, its vertical clay walls requiring the continuous calibration of automated laser theodolite arrays to detect any microscopic shifting in the structural footings of the surrounding high-rise structures. The gray drizzle had turned back into a cold, heavy downpour, mixing with a white powder of pulverized stone to create a fine, abrasive paste that coated the boots of the technicians and turned the floor of the pit into a dark, slippery theater of historical reclamation. Dr. Kincaid was now working inside the lower subgrade vault itself, her protective suit covered in the gray silt of the pulverized aggregate as she utilized a handheld sonic tomography array to map the density variations within the limestone bedrock floor beneath the carriage house foundation. The screen on her technical monitor was rendering a high-contrast digital silhouette that made her data assistant stop her logging sequence with a sharp intake of breath. Beneath the secondary brick floor of the mine shaft, embedded directly within a natural fissure in the limestone matrix, sat a second, unmapped cache, a series of 4 military-style steel storage containers whose handles were wrapped in thick lead wire seals from the late 1950s. The Circle of Silence wasn't 30 years old. It was an archaeological stack of institutional atrocities that went all the way down to the cold stone floor of the state's industrial history. Arthur Pendleton and his allies hadn't invented the methodology of administrative disposal. They had simply utilized a pre-existing network of hidden vaults, illegal chemical dump sites, and unmapped shafts that had been established by their fathers during the early years of the valley's manufacturing expansion. The cold case, of Maya Lin was merely the upper layer of a vertical stack of administrative atrocities that went all the way down to the bedrock of the state's history. We have an active chemical breach inside the secondary stratum. Dr. Kincaid's voice crackled through the tactical communication channel with a flat, clinical finality that dropped the temperature in the command trailer by 10 degrees. The video feed from her helmet camera showed the robotic manipulator claws moving through a layer of black, oily slurry that was bubbling slightly as it met the cold rainwater. The containers are suffering from advanced crevice corrosion due to 40 years of acid exposure from the coal silt above. The digital sniffing units are detecting a massive concentration of trichloroethylene and unrefined mercuric waste. If we don't establish a high-vacuum negative pressure containment tent within 90 minutes, the runoff will break through into the lower aquifer, turning the drinking water of 3 downstream counties into a permanent toxic hazard. The past isn't dead down here, Sarah. It's an active, pressurized machine that is still actively fighting back against the light. The news of the secondary toxic discovery hit the governor's emergency response unit like a physical blow, triggering the immediate deployment of specialized hazardous materials extraction teams from the national laboratories under direct federal escort. The Oakhaven model of forensic data mapping had broken more than a cold case. It had exposed a lingering public safety emergency that threatened to paralyze the state capital itself, converting a domestic homicide prosecution into a high-stakes ecological and national security crisis that was being monitored in real time from Washington. Inside his segregation cell at the Capitol facility, Arthur Pendleton sat with his back pressed firmly against the reinforced concrete wall, his eyes fixed on the small steel door hinge with an expression of calm, analytical detachment. He could hear the distant, low-frequency wail of the emergency sirens through the building's main ventilation lines, a sound he had spent 30 years listening for, a sound he had spent a lifetime of architectural and banking strategy trying to prevent from breaking through his perimeter. He didn't call for his corporate attorneys. He didn't check his transit chains. He simply closed his eyes and allowed his thin, skeletal smile to remain in place, the look of an executive who knew that even in his defeat, the machinery he had set in motion in 1996 would continue to demand a price from the living that no one in the system was prepared to pay. The legal dynamic was now moving with an absolute, unyielding velocity, the federal prosecutors drafting a comprehensive superseding RICO indictment that treated the entire county infrastructure system as a continuous criminal enterprise. This legal strategy effectively neutralized the defense's attempts to invoke statutory limitations, allowing the state to pursue maximum penalties, including life without the possibility of parole, for every single corporate officer, engineer, or public official who had signed a compliance log, accepted an anonymous dividend, or looked away from the concrete mixers on that rainy October morning 40 years ago. As the gray light of another winter evening began to fade into the thick, freezing fog of the Glen, the long convoy of hazardous materials containment vehicles moved out of the Central Plaza Center, their massive tires throwing up a fine spray of white slurry dust that coated the wet leaves of the hemlock trees along the ridge verges like a layer of gray salt. The long run through the dark spaces of the map was officially over for Clara Vance, her bones resting in a sterile tray inside the Capitol laboratory, her identity restored, and her black register logs converted into an absolute legal weapon against the men who had erased her. But for the city that had built its wealth on her silence, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The investigation was no longer about finding a man or closing a file. It was about the survival of the state's legal and physical infrastructure against the legacy of its own corruption. The long run through the dark spaces of the city blueprint was officially over for Arthur Pendleton, his name recorded in the federal registries as an institutional monster, his brownstone stripped of its records, and his identity reduced to a case file number inside the maximum security processing system. But for the valley that had built its wealth on his designs, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The morning light of June 18th did not break the atmospheric tension of the valley. It simply rendered the landscape of the excavation pit in a stark, high-definition clarity that stripped the location of its historical mystery, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unpainted bones of a structural crime. The command trailer had become a permanent annex of the Department of Justice, the communication arrays routing data directly to the Attorney General's office every 30 seconds to ensure that no regional administrative barrier could be used to slow down the technical clearance of the secondary vaults. The investigators were no longer wearing their standard police uniforms. They had been integrated into a centralized federal task force that operated with the cold, mathematical neutrality of a salvage team clearing an industrial wreck from a shipping channel. Detective Sarah Vance sat at her desk in the back of the trailer, her fingers tracing the embossed gold seal on the cover of her aunt's recovered register logbook. He had spent his entire adult career living inside the shadow of her absence, carrying the weight of a family history that had been rewritten by the very men who signed his paychecks. Today, looking at the high-contrast digital scans of the pages on his monitor, he realized that the closure he had been promised by the victim assistance coordinators was an artificial construct designed for people who didn't understand the physical geology of a hidden grave. Clara hadn't been lost. She had been used as a foundational anchor for a system of generational theft, a human marker pinned to the floor of the mine shaft to ensure that the balance sheet of the Vance Consortium remained clean in the eyes of the regulators. The financial fallout from the grand jury's supplementary true bills was currently crashing through the state's real estate market like a structural collapse. By 11 a.m., 4 of the regional banking firms that had underwritten the residential developments along Route 12 were placed into federal receivership, their boards of directors dismissed by corporate mandate after the auditing software identified an unbroken string of non-disclosure agreements stretching back to the winter of 1987. The titles to 30 separate logistics centers, retail plazas, and corporate parks were legally locked down by federal injunction, turning the most profitable economic corridor in the county into a frozen asset field that could not be sold, leased, or modified until the environmental clearance teams had reached the bedrock floor of every unmapped shaft in the district. The legal teams representing the remaining co-conspirators had completely abandoned their initial strategies of constitutional defense and procedural delay. They were now spending their hours inside the secure conference rooms of the federal detention complex, their desks piled high with encrypted hard drives, personal tax histories, and historical correspondence logs that they were desperate to turn over to the state's attorney in exchange for an immediate removal from the capital murder indictments. The circle of silence had transformed into a frantic, dawn-dap race for survival, the old names of the Valley elite turning on each other with a clinical, self-interested precision that exposed their celebrated corporate solidarity as nothing more than a temporary alliance of convenience designed to protect their profits from the light. At the base of the tipple, the hazardous materials teams had finished constructing a high-vacuum negative pressure containment tent over the mouth of the open shaft, its silver fabric inflating with a low, continuous hiss that sounded like a giant lung breathing through an iron filter. The automated environmental sniffing arrays were maintaining a zero-emission perimeter around the crater, their digital sensors tracking the parts per billion concentration of trichloroethylene and mercuric vapor to ensure that the chemical leak inside the secondary stratum did not clear the walls of the trench. The technicians moved through the airlocks in pairs, their white protective suits illuminated by the harsh blue glare of the high-output mobile floodlights, looking like industrial divers descending into an ocean of old grease and buried shame. Dr. Kincaid remained inside the control module of the robotic manipulation units, her fingers executing the commands that guided the automated core drills through the secondary concrete barrier that sealed the 1950s logistics cases. The work was an exercise in absolute technical caution. The acoustic sensors were recording a continuous series of microseismic shifts within the surrounding limestone formations, a warning that the structural integrity of the old mine works had been severely compromised by 40 years of continuous heavy transport vibrations along the highway overpass above. Every stroke of the drill was timed to match the frequency of the lateral earth movements, a mechanical choreography that turned the collection of evidence into a high-stakes surgical extraction where a single microsecond of miscalculation would trigger an absolute cave-in that would bury the truth forever beneath 10,000 tons of broken rock. The secondary drill has cleared the outer steel plating of the first military casing. Her voice came through the tactical channel, flat, steady, and completely stripped of any human color. The monitor screen on the commander's console showed the tip of the diamond-coated bit pulling back from a small, clean aperture in the dark green pane of the box, a thin stream of yellow, viscous oil draining into the vacuum retrieval cup below. The internal sensor array is identifying the primary chemical compound as stabilized liquid mustard agent, the exact military-grade batch configuration utilized during the classified chemical defense testing programs at the old arsenal in 1958. Harold's father didn't just dump paint runoff down here. He was leasing the subgrade infrastructure of this valley to the federal defense contractors as an unrecorded tactical disposal vault. The network goes all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. The revelation was a final, devastating detonation inside the historical narrative of the state, an absolute realization that the entire valley had functioned as a continuous, administrative dumping ground for the lethal waste of both corporate development and military manufacturing for nearly 3 generations. The Oakhaven model of data-driven tracking had broken through the crust of a multi-tiered regional conspiracy that had used the cover of small-town respectability and civic progress to maintain a total monopoly over the dark spaces of the map. They weren't dealing with an old murder file anymore. They were excavating the literal sewer of the state's political and industrial history, a vertical stack of hidden crimes that had been sealed beneath the asphalt of Route 12 to ensure that the citizens could continue to sleep, continue to work, and continue to pay their taxes in an absolute, engineered ignorance. Inside his maximum security cell, Arthur Pendleton did not request a copy of the new federal indictments. He sat on the edge of his steel cot with his hands flat on his knees, his eyes tracking the movement of a single cockroach along the seam of the reinforced concrete floor. He could hear the heavy, industrial vibration of the containment trucks clearing the main gate outside the facility, a sound he had anticipated since the night he watched the concrete mixers open their chutes into the darkness of the Glen in 1986. He had built his entire life on the assumption that if a secret is heavy enough, expensive enough, and buried beneath enough public infrastructure, the system will eventually choose to look away rather than pay the price of its exposure. But today, trapped within the cold, data-driven architecture of a modern forensic prosecution that didn't care about his name, his bank, or the solvency of his community, he was discovering that the truth is a nonlinear force, an active, pressurized engine that will eventually tear down every glass tower, every marble courthouse, and every multi-million-dollar suburban paradise to find the spot where the blood first met the stone. As the gray light of another winter evening began to fade into the thick, freezing fog of the Glen, the long convoy of hazardous materials containment vehicles moved out of the Central Plaza Center, their massive tires throwing up a fine spray of white slurry dust that coated the wet leaves of the hemlock trees along the ridge verges like a layer of gray salt. The long run through the dark spaces of the map was officially over for Clara Vance, her bones resting in a sterile tray inside the Capitol Laboratory, her identity restored, and her black register logs converted into an absolute legal weapon against the men who had erased her. But for the city that had built its wealth on her silence, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The high-tensile carbon fiber cables of the specialized recovery rig hummed with a low, vibrating drone that vibrated straight through the saturated clay floor of the courtyard behind the carriage house. The digital readout on the tactical command console inside the primary logistics vehicle flickered as the system clocked the time, 11:42 p.m. on June 17, 2026. This was the precise minute, adjusted through 30 years of chronological tracking, that matched the absolute termination of Maya Lin's biological signatures in the late summer of 1996. The air trapped between the brick walls of Elm Street had transformed from a standard humid mist into a pressurized, toxic cocktail of pulverized limestone dust, chemical vapors from ancient industrial runoffs, and the sharp scent of decaying cedar wood. The excavation was no longer a cautious forensic dig. It had shifted into an aggressive, large-scale industrial recovery operation, a high-visibility reclamation match against the literal infrastructure of a city that had spent 3 decades cementing its own corporate survival into the deep limestone bedrock of the historic district. Detective Sarah Vance did not turn her head when the tertiary telemetry terminal began to chime with a series of high-priority alerts from the state financial forensics database in the capital. Her face remained cold and completely motionless under the white, shadowless glare of the overhead LED arrays. Her fingers were clamped tightly around the edges of a vintage 1996 municipal ledger whose pages carried the dull yellow stain of old motor oil and battery acid. On the center monitor, the data-driven spatial map of the Ridgecrest Historic District was updating in real time, its boundaries bleeding high-contrast crimson as the federal asset forfeiture mainframe systematically isolated, froze, and seized the personal investment portfolios of every surviving director of the Neighborhood Preservation Society. The cold case label had been entirely incinerated by the absolute velocity of the documentation. What lay before the task force was an active, unyielding corporate racketeering prosecution that was dismantling the economic foundation of the town block by block. Look closely at the engineering manifests from the morning of Monday, August 26, 1996. The digital reproductions were flawless, each historical anomaly highlighted in bright orange vectors by the automated comparative profiling software. While the volunteer search parties were still wading through the deep river reeds looking for Maya's satchel keys, the city engineering department had dispatched 4 high-capacity concrete mixer trucks to the alley behind Arthur Pendleton's carriage house under an unaudited emergency utility mitigation order. The order had been signed by the county prosecutor's son himself, utilizing a falsified soil density report that claimed the historic root cellars were in imminent danger of collapsing beneath the weight of the expanding commercial zone. The mixers didn't drop standard municipal aggregate. They discharged 40 tons of high-density industrial concrete mixed with toxic iron slag, a low-porosity compound designed to dry cure under high hydrostatic pressure and form an absolute, permanent vault over whatever had been dropped down the shaft 6 hours earlier. The calculation behind this administrative move was an exercise in pure, cold-blooded institutional utility. Pendleton and his political allies inside the city hall understood that the modern history of the valley was being written by the commercial development banks that funded the downtown revitalization project. By using a state-backed public safety order to seal the primary forensic site before an official capital homicide investigation could even be authorized by the state police, they had effectively turned the infrastructure of the community into a continuous mechanism of obstruction. They had buried the evidence beneath a layer of civic progress, ensuring that every local merchant who took out a business loan to purchase a historic storefront along Elm Street was unconsciously underwriting the security of an administrative execution. In the secure detention module of the Capitol complex, the tactical isolation of the suspect had reached a state of total psychological attrition. Arthur Pendleton sat perfectly still in the center of the windowless holding room, his thin wrists cuffed to the heavy iron anchor ring welded directly into the steel table, his cardigan cuffs dusted with the white plaster particles from his broken kitchen wall. He did not look at the high-definition digital scans of his vintage 1988 Ford panel van that were pinned to the display monitor 3 inches from his face. His posture remained rigid, his chin tilted slightly upward in an expression of unyielding academic arrogance that had served him through 30 years of school board hearings, zoning audits, and grand jury inquiries. "You're operating outside your intellectual parameters, Sarah," Pendleton said, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone that didn't betray a single microsecond of cognitive panic or physical fatigue. "You think you've uncovered a crime, but you've simply stumbled into the structural reality of how this municipality was saved from extinction. In 1996, the historic district was a tax-delinquent liability field. The factories were dark, the banks were freezing the lines of local credit, and the children of this neighborhood had nothing to look forward to but the manufacturing waste dumps. That preservation grant didn't just clean up the brickwork, it brought $70 million of fresh capital into a dead market. It built the public transit hub, it funded the community health center, and it secured the property values of every family currently standing behind your barricades. Maya Lin wasn't an enemy of this community. She was an impediment to an economic development bond that saved 10,000 people from financial ruin. You cannot reverse 30 years of municipal history with a box of old bones and an old gold thimble. The statement was a window into the absolute, cold-blooded administrative sociopathy that had guided the modernization of the historic district for nearly half a generation. It wasn't an admission driven by an impulse of sudden passion or hidden guilt. It was a defense of organizational design, an argument that the destruction of a 22-year-old schoolteacher and the systematic falsification of 30 years of public property records were nothing more than necessary structural adjustments required to guarantee the long-term survival of the local banking system. The task force was realizing that the conspiracy of silence hadn't been sustained by threats or crude intimidation. It had been held together by the shared financial survival instinct of an entire social class that had built its status on the concrete seals Pendleton's mixers had poured in the dark. While his voice was being captured by the digital recording sensors, the operational situation at the Elm Street courtyard excavation site was rapidly descending into a high-stakes emergency. The automated scanning drones that had been deployed into the lower root cellar vault returned a series of live multispectral sonar profiles that caused the lead forensic anthropologist, Dr. Kincaid, to immediately halt the primary lifting rigs. Hidden beneath the concrete floor of the brick sarcophagus, less than 3 feet below the level where Maya's cedar chest had been recovered from the silt, the high-resolution scanners were rendering the distinct, undeniable geometry of a secondary, older deposit, a cluster of 4 military-style steel storage cylinders whose handles were secured by heavy, lead-wire seals from the late 1950s. The Circle of Silence wasn't 30 years old. It was an archaeological stack of institutional atrocities that extended all the way to the bedrock floor of the valley's industrial history. Arthur Pendleton and his allies hadn't invented the methodology of administrative disposal. They had simply inherited a pre-existing network of hidden vaults, illegal chemical dump sites, and unmapped shafts that had been established by their fathers during the early years of the valley's manufacturing consolidation. The unexpected witness hadn't just broken a cold case. His statement had punctured the crust of a massive, multi-tiered regional graveyard of industrial and political secrets, proving that the entire physical landscape of Ridgecrest was a deceptive illusion constructed to shield a legacy of capital crimes. "We have an active chemical breach inside the secondary stratum." Dr. Kincaid's voice crackled through the tactical communication channel, her breathing heavy and ragged through the internal microphone of her hazard suit. The video feed from her helmet camera showed the robotic manipulator claws moving through a layer of black, oily slurry that was bubbling slightly as it met the cold rainwater. The containers are suffering from advanced crevice corrosion due to 40 years of acid exposure from the coal silt above. The digital sniffing units are detecting a massive concentration of trichloroethylene and unrefined mercuric waste. If we don't establish a high-vacuum negative pressure containment tent within 90 minutes, the runoff will break through into the lower aquifer, turning the drinking water of 3 downstream counties into a permanent toxic hazard. The past isn't dead down here, Sarah. It's an active, pressurized machine that is still actively fighting back against the light. The news of the chemical contamination hit the state capitol like a high-velocity physical blow, triggering the immediate activation of the emergency management protocols and the deployment of specialized environmental remediation units from the federal laboratories under armed martial escort. The Oakhaven model of forensic investigation was no longer just an archival success or a historical tragedy. It had been transformed into an immediate, high-priority public safety crisis that threatened to paralyze the infrastructure of the entire valley corridor. The roadblocks along Elm Street were widened to 5 miles, the local airspace closed to civilian drones, and the low, rhythmic scream of the civil defense warning sirens began to echo across the empty streets of the commercial subdivisions. The Chandong Xe Hoi within the community had reached a stage of total, paralyzed silence. The morning digital news loops had transitioned from reporting on an old murder arrest into an uninterrupted, high-priority broadcast of a regional security emergency. The residents who had lived for decades under the assumption that their valley was a clean, traditional model of suburban development were now forcing themselves to watch the live video feeds of tactical hazmat teams deploying containment barriers around the old carriage house. The realization was setting into the collective consciousness like an absolute, suffocating poison. The elegant parks where their children played, the modern schools they trusted, and the very highway they used to commute to work were nothing more than a beautiful performance staged by a cartel of white-collar executioners who had used the invisible energy of an industrial empire to bury their crimes. Inside his segregation cell at the Capitol facility, Arthur Pendleton sat with his back pressed against the white concrete wall, his eyes fixed on the small steel door line with an expression of calm, analytical detachment. He could hear the distant, low-frequency wail of the emergency sirens through the building's main ventilation trunks, a sound he had spent 30 years listening for, a sound he had spent a lifetime of legal and zoning strategy trying to prevent from breaking through his perimeter. He didn't call for his corporate attorneys. He didn't check his chains. He simply closed his eyes and allowed a thin, skeletal smile to remain in place on his face, the look of an executive who knew that even in his defeat, the machinery he had set in motion in 1996 would continue to demand a price from the living that no one in the system was prepared to pay. The legal dynamic of the prosecution was now moving with an absolute, unyielding velocity, the federal prosecutors drafting a comprehensive superseding RICO indictment that treated the entire county infrastructure network as a continuous criminal enterprise. This legal strategy effectively neutralized the defense's attempts to invoke statutory limitations or jurisdictional technicalities, allowing the state to pursue maximum penalties, including life without the possibility of parole, for every single corporate officer, engineer, or public official who had signed a compliance log, accepted an anonymous corporate dividend, or looked away from the concrete mixers on that rainy October morning 40 years ago. As the gray light of another winter evening began to fade into the thick, freezing fog of the Glen, the long convoy of hazardous materials containment vehicles moved out of the Central Plaza Center, their massive tires throwing up a fine spray of white concrete dust that coated the wet leaves of the hemlock trees along the ridge verges like a layer of gray salt. The long run through the dark spaces of the map was officially over for Clara Vance, her bones resting in a sterile tray inside the Capitol laboratory, her identity restored, and her black register logs converted into an absolute legal weapon against the men who had erased her. But for the city that had built its wealth on her silence, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The operational acceleration was absolute. By midnight, the specialized core drilling platforms had broken through the primary structural ring of the second military storage cylinder. The internal optics feed, transmitted through a reinforced glass conduit to the monitoring van, revealed that the casing held exactly 14 gallons of stabilized liquid neurotoxin components, materials that had been cleared from the official military inventories during the strategic infrastructure reorganizations of 1961, but had been rerouted to the valley under a sequence of unaudited municipal disposal permits. The historical connection was verified within seconds by the federal archiving team. The permits carried the verified authorization signature of Arthur Pendleton's grandfather, revealing that the lineage of civic leadership in Ridgecrest was actually a multi-generational management apparatus for industrial concealment. The legal strategy developed by the U.S. Attorney's Field Office was designed to utilize this chronological depth as a mechanism for total asset liquidation. Under the emergency provisions of the Federal Contaminated Land Act and the RICO statutes, the prosecution filed a sweeping corporate asset freeze that targeted the commercial holdings of 42 separate real estate development firms across 3 states. The indictment argued that because the initial financial capital of the Ridgecrest Historic Preservation Society had been directly derived from the processing fees paid by the industrial manufacturing plants to use the subsurface mine workings as an unrecorded toxic vault, every dollar generated by the subsequent commercial redevelopments along Elm Street was legally classified as the direct proceeds of a continuous capital conspiracy. The economic fallout inside the valley was immediate and absolute, causing the regional credit markets to seize up before the opening bell of the morning trade. 3 major local mortgage institutions were placed into immediate federal receivership after their compliance databases identified an unbroken matrix of non-disclosure clauses that tied the title deeds of the suburban subdivisions to the unrecorded environmental liability waivers signed by Pendleton in the winter of 1996. The most valuable commercial acreage in the county had been turned into a frozen forensic field, its modern buildings empty, its infrastructure locked, and its corporate offices sealed by armed marshals who were systematically executing search warrants against the private files of the town's ruling elite. At the courtyard site, the technical crews were working inside a pressurized negative pressure containment structure that had been erected over the open pit, the silver fabric of the tent inflating with a continuous, low hiss from the air filtration engines. The technicians moved through the decontamination airlocks in pairs, their white positive pressure suits reflecting the harsh, blue glare of the mobile floodlight towers as they deployed the lead-lined extraction jackets around the remaining military containers. The acoustic array sensors were recording a steady pattern of minor earth movements within the surrounding limestone walls, a warning that the structural integrity of the entire block had been severely compromised by 30 years of continuous heavy commercial transport vibrations along the Elm Street overpass above. Dr. Kincaid remained inside the command pod of the robotic manipulation units, her fingers adjusting the joysticks that guided the high-vacuum retrieval claws through the soft mud of the lower mine stratum. Every single mechanical movement had to be synchronized with the seismic frequency data coming from the bedrock monitors, a complex, slow-motion choreography where a single microsecond of physical error would trigger a major structural cave-in that would collapse the surrounding financial towers and bury the remaining evidence forever beneath 10,000 tons of pulverized masonry. The structural load on the primary shoring jackets has reached 94% of maximum capacity. Her voice came through the tactical audio link, flat, clinical, and completely stripped of any human color. On the primary monitoring screen, the robotic claws were slowly closing around the neck of the final lead-shielded cylinder, lifting it out of the limestone matrix inch by inch, while a fine stream of yellow, viscous chemical runoff was captured by the high-pressure vacuum extraction tube below. The internal sensors are recording a critical drop in subsurface stability along the North Foundation Pier. We are clearing the final logistics cache now, but the ground is moving faster than our computers can recalculate the structural margins. The past is giving up its dead, Sarah, but it's trying to bring the whole street down into the pit with it. The news of the imminent structural failure hit the Central Precinct Command post like a physical blow, triggering the immediate execution of a mandatory evacuation order for every building within a 300-yard radius of the courtyard site. The empty avenues of the historic district were suddenly filled with the red and blue strobes of hundreds of federal response vehicles, their sirens combining with the steady, automated wail of the civil defense network to create a continuous wall of mechanical sound that shattered the final remaining illusions of peace in Ridgecrest. The town was no longer a living, self-sustaining community. It had been legally reclassified as an active federal disaster zone, its progress halted, its records seized, and its history exposed as a long-term performance staged by a syndicate of white-collar executioners who had used the absolute respectability of their positions to build an empire out of hidden tombs. Inside his maximum security containment cell at the Capitol complex, Arthur Pendleton did not look at the text of the superseding indictments that had been placed on the stainless steel ledge of his door. He sat motionless on the edge of his bunk, his eyes tracking the slow movement of a condensation drop running down the seam of the reinforced concrete wall across from his bars. He could hear the high-frequency vibration of the hazardous materials transport trucks clearing the outer gates of the facility, a sound he had anticipated since the night he watched the concrete mixers discharge their drums into the darkness behind his carriage house in 1996. He had built his entire life on the calculations of structural engineering, on the absolute certainty that if a secret is heavy enough, expensive enough, and buried beneath enough public infrastructure, the system will always choose to maintain the silence rather than pay the immense cost of its exposure. But today, trapped within the cold, data-driven architecture of a modern forensic prosecution that didn't care about his lineage, his academic standing, or the economic stability of his community, he was discovering that the truth is not a static variable to be balanced on a spreadsheet. It was an active, pressurized engine, a nonlinear force that would eventually rip through every layer of concrete, tear down every historic facade, and destroy every multi-million-dollar suburban paradise to find the exact spot where the blood had met the stone. The long run through the dark spaces of the map was officially over for the master teacher, his name recorded in the federal registries as an institutional monster, his identity reduced to a case file number, and his family's legacy erased from the history of the valley. As the gray light of another winter morning began to filter through the iron bars of his cell window, the air inside felt as cold and final as the limestone vault below, leaving nothing but the echo of the sirens and the cold, unalterable certainty that no secret can ever stay buried once the earth decides to speak. The high-intensity halogen floodlights mounted to the telescopic steel booms of the Mobile Forensic Command Center hummed with a low, electromagnetic vibration that resonated through the damp floorboards of the processing trailers. It was now 1:15 a.m. on June 18, 2026, and the tactical perimeter surrounding the Elm Street courtyard had been pushed back to a comprehensive 3-mile exclusion zone under the direct authority of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice. The stinging sleet that had pounded the Ridgecrest Historic District for hours had settled into a thick, freezing ice fog that clung to the brick cornices of the empty brownstones like a shroud of gray grease. Inside the primary analytics terminal, Detective Sarah Vance stood entirely motionless, the stark white glare of 3 high-resolution multispectral monitors illuminating the fine lines of exhaustion carved into her face as she watched the automated structural mapping software process the internal skeletal profiles recovered from the carriage house vault. The multi-agency task force was no longer operating with the cautious, archival pacing of a standard cold case inquiry. The investigation had assumed the relentless, dawn-dap velocity of an ongoing technological siege against a deep, multi-tiered structural archive of corporate violence. The criminalists from the State Forensic Division had spent the preceding 4 hours conducting a microscopic, millimeter-by-millimeter examination of the vintage 1988 Ford panel van that had been recovered from Arthur Pendleton's secondary storage lot near the riverfront. Using advanced chemical reagent sprays and high-output infrared scanners, they were systematically peeling back 30 years of commercial wax, mechanical grease, and deliberate environmental camouflage to expose the absolute, unvarnished physical truth of what had transpired inside that vehicle on the night of August 22, 1996. Look at the lateral impact vectors along the interior wheel well housings, the lead technical specialist stated, his voice flat and slightly distorted through the internal microphone of his full-face respirator mask as he pointed a digital stylus at the primary rendering terminal. The vehicle's structural floor wasn't just modified to carry standard educational specimens or neighborhood gardening supplies. The undercarriage crossmembers were reinforced with heavy, custom-welded angle iron from the old chemical refinery, the exact same high-density metallurgy that Pendleton's Preservation Society used to reinforce the security vaults inside the municipal archives in the early 90s. The internal odometer casing shows clear mechanical scoring lines under 300 times magnification, indicating that the gear teeth were manually forced back exactly 14,000 miles during the first week of September 1996. The vehicle didn't just happen to be in the area, it was mathematically prepared to function as a silent, heavy-load logistical platform for a capital disposal. The digital multispectral rendering was generating a high-contrast, 3-dimensional reconstruction of localized biological trauma that perfectly validated every line of the unexpected witness's deposition. Deep within the unsealed cellular structure of the van's replacement plywood floorboards, beneath 3 separate layers of aged commercial carpet and engine oil residue, the forensic scanners had isolated a widespread constellation of dark, starburst spatter patterns. The advanced luminol compounds had reacted with the iron-heavy trace elements of the degraded biological matter that had been locked inside the grain of the wood for 3 decades, causing the ancient crimson signatures to flare into sharp, iridescent violet lines on the monitors. The physical mechanics of the spatter, the precise velocity vectors, the impact angles, and the perfect 3-centimeter distribution arc converged on a single point of mechanical force that perfectly matched the cranial fracturing patterns identified by the medical examiner on the stainless steel examination trays 3 floors below. While the mobile laboratory teams were securing the chain of physical custody on the vehicle, a secondary, equally clinical operation was progressing inside the clean room of the command trailer, where the oilskin ledger book recovered from Maya Lin's classroom cash box had been stabilized inside a vacuum-sealed nitrogen hydration vault. The pages, which had been compressed by 30 years of anaerobic pressure and chemical fuel vapors into a single, brittle block of dried cellulose, were being treated with a fine, gaseous vapor designed to relax the ancient tree syrup adhesives without dissolving the ink. An automated high-resolution digital camera array was capturing each layer of text as the fibers slowly separated, converting a lost evening register into a definitive, searchable database of institutional racketeering. The lines of handwritten numbers flickering onto the data terminals were an absolute, devastating indictment of the entire 1996 Ridgecrest Historic Preservation Society. Maya Lin had systematically documented 42 separate, unrecorded cash and land transfer payouts made by regional real estate consortiums directly to the private offshore bank accounts managed by Arthur Pendleton. Each transaction was cross-referenced with specific municipal zoning files, detailing the exact dates that the state-funded preservation grants were being redirected to clear the legal titles of toxic industrial parcels along the Western Rail Spur. Her final notation, written at 10:14 p.m. on August 22, 1996, was a single circled tracking code accompanied by a handwritten question. The treasurer signed a clearance waiver for the North Quadrant wells today, noting that the biological contamination tests returned a 0 value. But the internal laboratory logs from the high school department show arsenic levels 300 times the state safety limit. Who is changing the numbers on the municipal certificates? The answer to that question had been delivered 40 minutes later with the blunt end of a solid 2-pound iron laboratory weight driven downward through the darkness of her balcony. The data points from the ledger were now aligning with the speed of a digital dragnet, allowing the federal prosecutors inside the Capitol complex to finalize a comprehensive racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations RICO indictment that treated the entire Neighborhood Preservation Society of 1996 as a continuous, joint criminal syndicate. This legal strategy was a massive, unprecedented escalation that effectively paralyzed the defense's attempts to invoke the statute of limitations, transforming the case from an archival cold case into an active, live enterprise of public fraud, systemic forgery, and capital murder under color of civic office. The Chandong Xa Hoi within the community of Ridgecrest had transitioned from spontaneous public outrage into a state of total, paralyzed horror. The morning digital news channels had gone live with the high-resolution images of the cedar chest and the transcripts of Maya's final log entries within 20 minutes of their verification, sending a wave of visceral revulsion through the historic district and the surrounding suburban subdivisions. The residents who had lived for nearly 3 decades under the comforting assumption that their town was a clean, traditional model of post-industrial success were now forcing themselves to realize that every park, every renovated facade, and every civic library that bore the Preservation Society's seal of approval was a monument constructed out of the literal profits of an execution. The public trust that had held the neighborhood together was dissolving in real time, replaced by a creeping, toxic paranoia that turned every old property transaction, every closed-door council vote, and every retired local official into a suspected accessory to a 30-year-old murder. Inside the high-security interrogation module at the Capitol Detention Wing, the psychological dynamic between Detective Sarah Vance and the master biology teacher had devolved into an absolute vacuum of empathy. Arthur Pendleton sat perfectly straight in his steel chair, his wrists cuffed to the heavy iron ring welded directly into the metal surface of the table, his silver hair catching the flat, shadowless glare of the recessed halogen panels above. His wool cardigan was gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange detention jumpsuit, but he wore the uniform as if it were a tailored academic robe, his eyes tracking the digital document projectors on the wall with a cold, glassy detachment that showed no indication of cognitive panic or physical fatigue. "You're chasing ghosts through a house that we built for you, Sarah," Pendleton said, his voice dropping into that smooth, authoritative baritone that had commanded the regional bank boards and civic societies for half a century. The numbers in those old school notebooks don't change the physical reality of what this family did to preserve the economic life of this valley. In 1996, the historic district was a bankrupt liability field. The factories were dark, the commercial credit lines were frozen, and the state wasn't going to fund a multi-million-dollar restoration project for a community that was rotting from the inside out. We needed that development capital, and we needed the land clearance along Elm Street to secure the infrastructure bonds from Chicago. If Maya Lin had taken those water logs to the state environmental inspectors, the banks would have defaulted the entire development bond before the first brick was laid. I didn't authorize a collection out of personal malice. I authorized an administrative correction to protect the solvency of 10,000 families. You sit there with your badges and your digital data screens, but your education, your career, and the very road you drove to get to this facility were paid for by the concrete we poured behind that carriage house. The statement was a window into the absolute, cold-blooded administrative sociopathy that had guided the development of the region for nearly half a generation. It wasn't an admission of guilt driven by remorse. It was a defense of organizational design, an argument that the destruction of a 22-year-old schoolteacher and the systematic falsification of 30 years of public property records were nothing more than necessary structural adjustments required to guarantee the long-term survival of the local banking system. The task force was realizing that the conspiracy of silence hadn't been held together by crude fear or criminal intimidation. It had been sustained by the shared financial survival instinct of an entire social class that had built its status on the concrete seals Pendleton's mixers had poured in the dark. The legal fallout from this perspective was an absolute catastrophe for the state's judicial and political hierarchy. At 2:15 a.m., the state Supreme Court issued an emergency administrative order that suspended the active status of every single judge who had been appointed during the tenure of the 1996 county prosecutor's office, a move that effectively locked the doors of the circuit court buildings across 4 counties. The legal system was in a state of total, uncontrolled collapse, its historical decisions contaminated by the presence of men who had used the gavels of justice to protect a criminal enterprise that had entombed a whistleblower beneath the municipal plaza. At the excavation site in the center of the courtyard, the physical reconstruction had assumed the complex, high-friction geometry of a structural engineering emergency. The trench between Pendleton's brownstone and Maya's old apartment building had been deepened to 85 feet, its vertical clay walls requiring the continuous calibration of automated laser theodolite arrays to detect any microscopic shifting in the structural footings of the surrounding high-rise structures. The gray drizzle had turned back into a cold, heavy downpour, mixing with the white powder of pulverized stone to create a fine, abrasive paste that coated the boots of the technicians and turned the floor of the pit into a dark, slippery theater of historical reclamation. The automated robotic manipulator units, controlled by technicians sitting inside the lead-shielded trailers 50 yards away, had successfully attached a high-tensile carbon fiber lifting yoke around the neck of the cesium, 137 cylinder. The process was agonizingly slow, a rhythm of fractions of an inch that turned the center of the commercial district into a high-stakes mechanical theater where every breath was measured by the clicking of the digital radiation monitors. The electronic sensors inside the pit were recording a steady decrease in structural stability, the shifting of the blue clay stratum beneath the foundation pier threatening to trigger the dead man's grounding switch before the lift could be completed. Steady on the primary hoist, Detective Sarah Vance ordered through the tactical channel, her hands gripping the edge of the control console so tight her knuckles were white. She watched the primary camera feed from the interior of the vault, where the robotic claws were slowly rising, lifting the 40-year-old steel cylinder out of its concrete matrix inch by inch. The slurry water at the bottom of the pit was boiling slightly, heated by the friction of the mechanical arms and the high-energy output of the degraded containment casing, a pale steam rising through the floodlights that looked like phantom breath in the freezing fog. At exactly 3:45 a.m., the digital display on the radiation monitors experienced a sudden, sharp drop in frequency. Not a failure of the sensors, but a confirmation that the cesium cylinder had been successfully lifted free of the structural footings and sealed inside the 3-ton lead containment cask that sat on the back of the extraction vehicle. The immediate radiological threat to the valley had been neutralized, leaving behind a deep, empty crater in the center of the westbound lane that exposed the raw limestone bedrock floor of the valley for the first time since the winter of 1986. But the relief inside the command trailer was short-lived. As the technicians adjusted the secondary multispectral scanning arrays to verify the cleanliness of the open pit, the sensors picked up a secondary, unmapped anomaly sitting directly beneath the location where the cesium casing had been anchored. Hidden beneath a secondary layer of unreinforced structural concrete, less than 3 feet below the level where Clara Vance's cash box had been recovered from the mud, the high-resolution sonar profiles were rendering the unmistakable signatures of a secondary, older deposit, a series of 4 small, metallic containers whose structural alignments matched the obsolete design patterns of the military logistics cases used during the chemical weapon manufacturing tests of the late 1950s. The Circle of Silence wasn't 40 years old. It was a multi-generational archive of institutional violence that had been using the Blackwood Valley as a disposal ground for nearly a century. Harold Vance and his allies hadn't invented the system. They had merely built the modern commercial center over the top of a pre-existing graveyard of regional secrets, using their engineering expertise to turn the highways and industrial hubs of the district into a permanent monument to an empire of hidden crimes. The cold case of Clara Vance was merely the upper layer of a vertical stack of administrative atrocities that went all the way down to the bedrock of the state's history. Inside his cell at the administrative segregation facility, Harold Vance sat with his eyes closed, his back pressed against the white concrete wall, his thin smile remaining frozen in place as the sounds of the emergency sirens finally began to clear from the ventilation lines. He didn't need to see the telemetry data from the pit. He had known what was beneath the blue clay since the day his father had handed him the original survey maps of the valley in 1974. He had executed his design with a perfect understanding of what he was protecting, building a multi-million-dollar banking empire that was mathematically guaranteed to act as an absolute shield for the history of his class. He had outsmarted the detectives, outlived the prosecutors, and outrun the memory of his neighbors, and even today, with the transit chains around his ankles, he knew that the system he had constructed would continue to demand a price from the living that no one was prepared to pay. The federal prosecutors were already compiling the framework for the next, most sweeping round of indictments under the emergency provisions of the National Security Acts, a legal process that effectively bypassed the standard judicial delays and allowed for the permanent seizure of every asset, every record, and every land title deed within a 50-mile radius of the Blackwood Municipal Center. The town was no longer a living community. It had been legally reclassified as an active federal research zone, its progress halted, its economy frozen, and its future locked inside the steel cabinets of a forensic investigation that would take decades to complete. As the gray light of another winter evening began to fade into the thick, toxic mist of the valley, the long convoy of hazardous materials containment vehicles moved out of the Glen Center, their massive tires throwing up a fine spray of white concrete dust that coated the wet leaves of the hemlock trees along the ridge verges like a layer of gray salt. The long run through the dark spaces of the city blueprint was officially over for Clara Vance, her bones resting in a sterile tray inside the Capitol Laboratory, her identity restored, and her black notebook converted into an absolute legal weapon against the men who had erased her. But for the city that had built its wealth on her silence, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The investigation was no longer about finding a man or closing a file. It was about the survival of the state's legal and physical infrastructure against the legacy of its own corruption. The long run through the dark spaces of the city blueprint was officially over for Harold Vance, his name recorded in the federal registries as an institutional monster, his brownstone stripped of its records, and his identity reduced to a case file number inside the maximum security processing system. But for the valley that had built its wealth on his designs, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The morning light of June 18th did not break the atmospheric tension of the valley. It simply rendered the landscape of the excavation pit in a stark, high-definition clarity that stripped the location of its historical mystery, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unpainted bones of a structural crime. The command trailer had become a permanent annex of the Department of Justice, the communication arrays routing data directly to the Attorney General's office every 30 seconds to ensure that no regional administrative barrier could be used to slow down the technical clearance of the secondary vaults. The investigators were no longer wearing their standard police uniforms. They had been integrated into a centralized federal task force that operated with a cold, mathematical neutrality of a salvage team clearing an industrial wreck from a shipping channel. Detective Marcus Vance sat at his desk in the back of the trailer, his fingers tracing the embossed gold seal on the cover of his aunt's recovered register logbook. He had spent his entire adult career living inside the shadow of her absence, carrying the weight of a family history that had been rewritten by the very men who signed his paychecks. Today, looking at the high-contrast digital scans of the pages on his monitor, he realized that the closure he had been promised by the victim assistance coordinators was an artificial construct designed for people who didn't understand the physical geology of a hidden grave. Clara hadn't been lost. She had been used as a foundational anchor for a system of generational theft, a human marker pinned to the floor of the mine shaft to ensure that the balance sheet of the Vance Consortium remained clean in the eyes of the regulators. The financial fallout from the grand jury's supplementary true bills was currently crashing through the state's real estate market like a structural collapse. By 11 a.m., 4 of the regional banking firms that had underwritten the residential developments along Route 12 were placed into federal receivership, their boards of directors dismissed by corporate mandate after the auditing software identified an unbroken string of non-disclosure agreements stretching back to the winter of 1987. The titles to 30 separate logistics centers, retail plazas, and corporate parks were legally locked down by federal injunction, turning the most profitable economic corridor in the county into a frozen asset field that could not be sold, leased, or modified until the environmental clearance teams had reached the bedrock floor of every unmapped shaft in the district. The legal teams representing the remaining co-conspirators had completely abandoned their initial strategies of constitutional defense and procedural delay. They were now spending their hours inside the secure conference rooms of the federal detention complex, their desks piled high with encrypted hard drives, personal tax histories, and historical correspondence logs that they were desperate to turn over to the state's attorney in exchange for an immediate removal from the capital murder indictments. The circle of silence had transformed into a frantic, dawn-dap race for survival, the old names of the Valley elite turning on each other with a clinical, self-interested precision that exposed their celebrated corporate solidarity as nothing more than a temporary alliance of convenience designed to protect their profits from the light. At the base of the tipple, the hazardous materials teams had finished constructing a high-vacuum negative-pressure containment tent over the mouth of the open shaft, its silver fabric inflating with a low, continuous hiss that sounded like a giant lung breathing through an iron filter. The automated environmental sniffing arrays were maintaining a zero-emission perimeter around the crater, their digital sensors tracking the parts per billion concentration of trichloroethylene and mercuric vapor to ensure that the chemical leak inside the secondary stratum did not clear the walls of the trench. The technicians moved through the airlocks in pairs, their white protective suits illuminated by the harsh blue glare of the high-output mobile floodlights, looking like industrial divers descending into an ocean of old grease and buried shame. Dr. Kincaid remained inside the control module of the robotic manipulation units, her fingers executing the commands that guided the automated core drills through the secondary concrete barrier that sealed the 1950s logistics cases. The work was an exercise in absolute technical caution. The acoustic sensors were recording a continuous series of microseismic shifts within the surrounding limestone formations, a warning that the structural integrity of the old mine works had been severely compromised by 40 years of continuous heavy transport vibrations along the highway overpass above. Every stroke of the drill was timed to match the frequency of the lateral earth movements, a mechanical choreography that turned the collection of evidence into a high-stakes surgical extraction where a single microsecond of miscalculation would trigger an absolute cave-in that would bury the truth forever beneath 10,000 tons of broken rock. The secondary drill has cleared the outer steel plating of the first military casing. Her voice came through the tactical channel, flat, steady, and completely stripped of any human color. The monitor screen on the commander's console showed the tip of the diamond-coated bit pulling back from a small, clean aperture in the dark green pane of the box, a thin stream of yellow, viscous oil draining into the vacuum retrieval cup below. The internal sensor array is identifying the primary chemical compound as stabilized liquid mustard agent, the exact military-grade batch configuration utilized during the classified chemical defense testing programs at the old arsenal in 1958. Harold's father didn't just dump paint runoff down here. He was leasing the subgrade infrastructure of this valley to the federal defense contractors as an unrecorded tactical disposal vault. The network goes all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. The revelation was a final, devastating detonation inside the historical narrative of the state, an absolute realization that the entire valley had functioned as a continuous, administrative dumping ground for the lethal waste of both corporate development and military manufacturing for nearly 3 generations. The Oakhaven model of data-driven tracking had broken through the crust of a multi-tiered regional conspiracy that had used the cover of small-town respectability and civic progress to maintain a total monopoly over the dark spaces of the map. They weren't dealing with an old murder file anymore. They were excavating the literal sewer of the state's political and industrial history, a vertical stack of hidden crimes that had been sealed beneath the asphalt of Route 12 to ensure that the citizens could continue to sleep, continue to work, and continue to pay their taxes in an absolute, engineered ignorance. Inside his maximum security cell, Arthur Pendleton did not request a copy of the new federal indictments. He sat on the edge of his steel cot with his hands flat on his knees, his eyes tracking the movement of a single cockroach along the seam of the reinforced concrete floor. He could hear the heavy, industrial vibration of the containment trucks clearing the main gate outside the facility, a sound he had anticipated since the night he watched the concrete mixers open their chutes into the darkness of the Glen in 1986. He had built his entire life on the assumption that if a secret is heavy enough, expensive enough, and buried beneath enough public infrastructure, the system will eventually choose to look away rather than pay the price of its exposure. But today, trapped within the cold, data-driven architecture of a modern forensic prosecution that didn't care about his name, his bank, or the solvency of his community, he was discovering that the truth is a nonlinear force, an active, pressurized engine that will eventually tear down every glass tower, every marble courthouse, and every multi-million-dollar suburban paradise to find the spot where the blood first met the stone. As the gray light of another winter evening began to fade into the thick, freezing fog of the Glen, the long convoy of hazardous materials containment vehicles moved out of the Central Plaza Center, their massive tires throwing up a fine spray of white slurry dust that coated the wet leaves of the hemlock trees along the ridge verges like a layer of gray salt. The long run through the dark spaces of the map was officially over for Clara Vance, her bones resting in a sterile tray inside the Capitol Laboratory, her identity restored, and her black register logs converted into an absolute legal weapon against the men who had erased her. But for the city that had built its wealth on her silence, the concrete was still coming apart, the vaults were still opening, and the graves were still breathing their long-delayed secrets out into the cold, blinding light of a day that had finally run out of space to hide the truth. The clock on the wall of the federal grand jury room inside the Capitol Judicial Complex clicked past midnight with a cold, metallic sharpness that seemed to slice through the windowless, white-tiled silence of the secure wing. It was now June 18, 2026, and the legal framework surrounding the Ridgecrest investigation had completely broken through the traditional boundaries of a historical cold case prosecution. The 23 grand jurors sat in steep, tiered rows, their faces illuminated by the pale, shadowless glare of digital document projectors that were rendering 30 years of municipal forgery, asset laundering, and coordinated execution into a flawless sequence of federal racketeering counts. In the center of the room, anchored to the stainless steel witness table under the unblinking beam of a high-intensity halogen array, sat Donald Greer, the unexpected witness whose terminal diagnosis had shattered the valley's longest-standing wall of silence. The 58-year-old former mining mechanic looked small inside his oversized hospital fleece, his hands permanently lined with old coal grease, shaking slightly as he pulled a secondary microphone closer to his mouth. His voice was a flat, clinical rattle that carried no emotional inflection, no theatrical desire for drama, and no plea for personal absolution. He was simply reading from his own signed deposition, converting the visceral nightmare of August 22nd, 1996, into the definitive, unalterable language of a federal capital indictment. "We didn't use the standard entrance to the historic district works," Greer stated, his knuckles turning white against the edge of the metal table. The Preservation Society's operations manager knew that the state police night shift patrol was scheduled to conduct a commercial vehicle checkpoint over on the interstate loop. He had the keys to the municipal storage compound behind the courthouse annex. "We backed the Ford panel van directly into the maintenance bay where the concrete aggregates were staged for the Elm Street courtyard restoration pour." Maya Lin's classroom cash box was sitting on the front seat of the cab, its brass latch already broken open with a tire iron. There was exactly $412 in cash and a stack of duplicate internal fuel logs inside. The logs were what mattered to Arthur Pendleton. He was sitting in his sedan out by the perimeter fence, watching the mixer drums turn through his rear-view mirror. He didn't step out into the rain. He just nodded his head when the truck cleared the gate, and that was the executive order. The transcript of his testimony was being routed through an encrypted fiber optic pipeline to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., where a specialized task force on public corruption was using the data points to finalize a sweeping multi-state RICO indictment. The Oak Haven model of data-driven forensic mapping had turned the Ridgecrest case into a total systemic demolition. Every single property deed, zoning variance, and municipal infrastructure bond issued by the county planning board since the mid-90s was now legally classified as an ongoing overt act in furtherance of a lethal criminal enterprise, exposing the Valley's celebrated era of suburban modernization as a long-term corporate fraud. While Greer map-read the internal logistics of the conspiracy before the grand jury, a secondary tactical offensive was unfolding at an isolated, long-abandoned rail spur 4 miles north of the Elm Street perimeter. Federal agents from the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Enforcement Division, backed by tactical operators from the Marshal Service, had used hydraulic cutters to breach the gates of a secure storage facility that had been registered under an obsolete timber clearance alias since 1997. They weren't hunting for archival paper files or digital hard drives anymore. They were excavating the physical logistics cache of the 1996 illegal deep well drilling and toxic waste injection operations. Using heavy industrial cranes, the recovery teams extracted 42 sealed, stainless steel core sample cylinders from the back of the dark concrete bays. The internal atmosphere of the facility was thick with the scent of wet soot, rotted canvas, and the unmistakable, sweet-sour chemical sting of unrefined industrial chemicals that had sweated through the rubber gaskets of the storage valves over nearly 3 decades. When the technicians tapped the first cylinder with a digital pressure gauge, the internal sensors registered a dangerous concentration of trichloroethylene and volatile organic compounds, a concentrated chemical time capsule that matched the exact molecular signature Maya Lin had documented in her oilskin ledger hours before her erasure. The web of evidence was now an absolute, bulletproof wall of physical, chemical, and digital data that left the defensive strategies of the Valley's remaining elite completely paralyzed. By 3 a.m., the federal task force had initiated a secondary wave of high-priority arrests that targeted 8 retired executives from the Regional Transit Commission and 3 former directors of the State Environmental Compliance Board, men who had spent their winters in private country clubs and their summers on luxury yachts, believing that their connection to the old political machine would protect them from the consequences of their youth forever. But as the transit chains clicked around their age-spotted wrists, their faces showed the same vacant, recognized hollow that the master architect had displayed when the flashbangs breached his foyer, the look of men who knew that the timer they had set in 1996 had finally run down to zero. The Chandong Tom Ly within the community of Ridgecrest had reached a stage of total, paralyzed silence. The morning editions of the digital news loops had gone live with the transcripts of Greer's grand jury testimony within 15 minutes of its verification, the image of the old mechanic explaining the murder of a 22-year-old kindergarten teacher as a necessary corporate alignment, triggering a collective state of shock among the residents. The people who had lived for 30 years under the illusion that their valley was a clean, traditional model of post-industrial success were now forcing themselves to look at the elegant marble plazas, the high-speed transit terminals, and the glittering glass skyscrapers with a sense of deep, visceral revulsion. They were realizing that every step they took through the commercial center was an insult to a hidden grave, a walk over the bones of a woman who had tried to save their children from the toxic residue of the very buildings they worked in every day. At the excavation site in the center of the courtyard, the tactical operation had turned into a deep subway structural salvage. The trench had been widened to 60 feet, its raw concrete walls held back by massive hydraulic shoring shields that hissed and groaned continuously as they absorbed the immense lateral weight of the surrounding buildings. The rain over the city had stopped, leaving behind a cold, thick winter fog that settled into the crater like a shroud, turning the floodlights into long, blinding spears of white glare that cut through the dark like open wounds against the skin of the city center. Dr. Kincaid remained inside the lower subgrade vault, her respirator mask catching the pale light as she used a micro-vacuum sieve to recover the final trace elements from the floor of the brick sarcophagus. The forensic clearance was nearly complete. The stainless steel trays containing the skeletal elements of Maya Lin had already been loaded into the medical examiner's vehicle under armed federal escort, but the site itself was still yielding a narrative of terrifying, mechanical calculation. Tucked into a narrow drainage recess beneath the vault's primary support beam, the technicians discovered a second satchel, not the leather one belonging to the school teacher, but a heavy canvas tool bag containing a complete set of city-issue valve keys, 2 sets of blank municipal transit logs from August 1996, and a vintage Motorola two-way radio whose battery had leaked a green, crystalline crust across the internal circuit board. The item was a physical monument to the logistics of the cover-up, a proof that the night shift crew had been on-site with the specific intent of modifying the infrastructure to receive the body long before the concrete mixers cleared the refinery gates. The serial numbers on the radio were cross-referenced with the inventory archives of the Department of Water and Power within 40 minutes, revealing that the unit had been checked out on the morning of August 22, 1996, by none other than the former police captain who had signed the initial, fraudulent runaway logs. The ring of silence was shrinking into a single, tight knot of absolute complicity, proving that every arm of the local government had functioned as an active gear in the machine that had crushed Maya Lin's future. Inside his cell at the Administrative Segregation Unit on the western edge of the Capitol, Judge Alexander Vance sat motionless under the unblinking eye of the security camera. The television monitor on the wall across from his bunk was broadcasting a live aerial view of the municipal plaza, where the heavy excavator rigs were beginning the process of backfilling the trench with clean, non-structural gravel under federal supervision. He did not look at his hands. His skin had turned the gray color of old parchment, his eyes